Okay, I get it. It's a low-hanging fruit, but the tree of gaming ain't all that tall. And besides, even the low-hanging fruit get picked during the harvest. That might be the most pretentious editing I have ever done. When most people think bottom-of-the-barrel military shooters, the Battlefield series tends to fly under the radar. This probably has something to do with the fact that they are EA titles exclusive to Origin, which I begrudgingly installed for this video. And it's easy to forget Battlefield when Call of Duty is busy being the class clown. I think DICE is thankful that fuck-stick critics like me usually go for those juicy, shiny apples at the top of the 4-foot apple tree that is this industry, and don't get our shovels out to go digging for the fruit so low that they've buried. Like, props to EA for being the living example of what happens when you don't regulate online DRM. This game has it. Its startup process involves running the EXE, opening the account there, then launching the game through the browser, and since I had two-step verification that went off every time I tried to start up the game, I've gotten more text messages from EA in the past 2 weeks than I've gotten from prospective sexual partners in the last 2 years. The DRM is primarily there because the Battlefield series, at the insistence of EA, has shifted a very heavy focus to its multiplayer aspects, and I wonder why. But there's not really any point to doing an analysis video on a multiplayer game. I mean, it's not impossible, but it would be a lot of chatting about the balance of weapons and map design and really boring shit I don't want to do right now. And besides, what's the point? They made Battlefield 4 in terms of multiplayer, so it fixed most of the issues I'd bring up anyways. So we're going to stick solely to the single player. Maybe in the future when I have a bit more of an audience, I'd invite people to come play the co-op missions with me, but oh well. The game is a blatant tech demo for the Frostbite 2 engine, which is very confusing considering the game uses pre-rendered cutscenes. It is, well and truly, a blatant advertisement for developers to consider developing inside this pretty looking engine. And I guess it holds up. Shame a total of 4 games, all developed at EA, were made in it. But the pre-rendered cutscenes, they don't hold up as well. Call of Duty didn't have this, which meant there was a parity between gameplay sections and the in-engine sections. Of course, even for the time, Modern Warfare was kind of ugly. Battlefield 3, on the other hand, for the time, looked pretty good, but had that disparity. This was the first game I played as a kid that real dynamic battle damage was included in. Alright, I remember this looking better, but I mean, this mission in the Paris Stock Exchange, where it's a gunfight in an office environment, does do a pretty good job. Just a shame more of the impressive stuff is pre-scripted, and not actual dynamic effects. And this is a reminder that Ubisoft is never going to use Rainbow Six Siege's destruction engine in a single-player shooter. The game does have an obsession with lens flare and excessive bloom, and murky and dirty effects over the camera that are honestly just ugly to look at. And every now and then in a level you'll reach a point where you look somewhere unintended and see a vast empty space, while the rest of the intended level is super hyper detailed. I mean, it looks better than some of the other shooters that came out in 2011, but that's hardly fair. Seriously though, the effects used on this level are great, especially the rain. I am a sucker for good rain in video games, but that's just my Pacific Northwest blood speaking. But even though the effects are cool, the developers don't trust the player enough to actually walk through the level aboard the ship or on the deck, so the effect is entirely wasted on what is effectively just a cutscene. A later mission will also be set in the rain, but it's a stealth sniper mission, so again, that's just a cutscene. Thankfully, this game isn't just set in the generic Middle East like Modern Warfare was. It concretely establishes the locales of the game. This time it starts in Iraq and moves on to Iran. But to explain that, we have to get into the story, so let's crack this open. In medias res. It's a narrative structuring device where a later event kicks off the beginning of the story. It's an interesting way to tell a story when well done, but can be easily messed up, so unless you really know what you're doing, it's better to stick to linear narrative structures. The great writers at DICE, however, are clearly experienced veterans of games writing and so carry on. The pros of In Medias Res is that it can be a solid hook for a story. There are questions to ask about this intro. Who are we? Why are we running from the police, and where are we in the world? Why do we jump on a train, and why are there terrorists on it? Who are the terrorists, and what are their motivations? These questions, and more, should be answered by the story over its course. There are downsides to in medias res, however. For one, characters shown in the hook are immortal over the course of the game. We know any chance of the game trying to pull a Paul Jackson and kill us halfway through aren't going to happen until this sequence passes. Likewise, this terrorist guy shown is also immortal. This can be a big tension killer since multiple times the game will try and tease the player with their potential death, only for the player to go, but wait, they survive until the end of the game. In medias res also has a big demand for recontextualization. Posing all these questions only to answer them all in the first arc of the story leaves a story where 2/3 will be spent filling time waiting for this train scene. If you structure the story like this and then don't pay it off in a big way, it drags down the value of the entire work with it. Recontextualization is the important word here, and medias res is not some cheap disposable tactic to draw interest, you have to earn it. Since the scene in question is so black and white, nothing is provided context when replaying the scene at the end of the game. The main character isn't committing some great sin that is actually justified when given context. The only thing that gets colored in is some circumstances, which just isn't interesting enough to justify spoiling the endgame of the story as the first mission. The big problem, however, is that the developers decided to hedge their structural bets. Rather than trying to rely on the interest generated by the hook of in medias res, they also use what I call interrogation narration. I'm sure there's an actual term for it, but I couldn't find it in 5 minutes of Google, and as a millennial, this means that it is simply ancient lost knowledge. Interrogation narration is basically the plot structure where a story is recounted by a narrator, usually the main character, to an investigative force. So to draw a diagram, you can see that in medias res basically forms a simple loop, while interrogation narration creates breaks in the story. The advantage of the interrogation narration is that it allows multiple perspectives of an event, or for the writer to naturally insert information into a story that the main character wouldn't otherwise be able to know. Worth noting is that Call of Duty Modern Warfare managed to do all of those things while maintaining a linear narrative structure by simply changing the narrative perspective at the appropriate times. This advantage really isn't used. While the game does use it as an opportunity to include multiple playable characters, only one of these missions actually happened outside the knowledge of the main character anyways. I could rearrange the sequence of events in Battlefield 3 based on what happened chronologically, and it wouldn't really hurt the story until the end. And I think it would be a better story for it than including these CSI rejects to help tell this tale of the great Sergeant Blackburn. So finally, once the writers have gotten done making absolutely sure that the house is framed perfectly, it's time to actually start building.
And by that, I mean you look like shit.
I know, it's what happens when character designers want to differentiate their main characters. Blackburn looks like a 40-year-old drug addict, not a Marine. His face is long and his cheeks are so gaunt that the lower half of his face looks like his jaw is about to break loose from his skull, while his skin has been given an uncanny amount of detail not present in any of the other characters.
I'm ugly and I'm proud.
The premise is that Blackburn here ended up in the custody for reasons that won't be shared until an hour and a half into the story because all the characters already know why. Good job not expositing the entire situation onto us. Blackboard is then tasked with recounting the events of the story which have already chronologically happened so that we, the audience, and his interrogators might be given the context needed to explain what the hell is happening. The game opens with a very, very hard cut to Johnny Cash, which I can't show you because I'm not taking a chance with the 15 music companies that will claim to own the song and start showing ads on my videos. The cut is very hard, like jump scare hard. Hey, if you want to reference Generation Kill in your game so much, why don't you open with the main characters themselves singing the song? You know, do a bit of characterization for these lads, instead of none at all.
PLR's the right people, alright?
PLR are going to shoot you within half an hour. Guaranteed. Knew it.
Dude, that's a fucking 50.
21 against says that no, that's not. It's probably a Dragunov, which is a 7.62x54, big, but not 50 big. That's what most hit-and-run snipers in Iraq used. James here would have had his insides blown the fuck out if he had got hit in the chest with a 50. Worth noting here is that Blackborg here is the team's designated marksman, so he carries a Mark 11 in addition to his M4, but he's also apparently the best shot with the rocket launcher.
I got AT. Give it to Black. You're the best shot. You see that?
In fact, in later missions, he's always the one who uses the anti-tank and anti-air weapons. I guess the game wanted to go with a bit of realism and say, you know, real-life 1st Recon Marine soldiers don't usually carry a sidearm. I mean, one gun is a pain in the ass. A sidearm you'd probably never use is just added logistics, which, honestly, Paul Jackson would probably still be alive if he wasn't weighed down by that Beretta. Really though, the absence of pistols in the main campaign is a symptom of a bigger problem. The game is well and truly boring. Almost every weapon in Battlefield 3 feels exactly the same, except for shotguns. Battlefield 3 actually has some pretty fun shotguns, since every pellet is given a big tracer and the range doesn't drop off immediately. Snipers, on the other hand, are heavily limited by the maps. Since the maps typically have sightlines shorter than 300 meters, there isn't really a situation where the generic assault rifles aren't going to do well. I do remember this game being the first game I played where selective fire was an option, which, while cool, isn't really useful. Since recoil is easily dealt with, aiming in the general direction of enemies and spraying is far more effective than switching to semi-auto and actually aiming. This was also the first game I remember playing which let you chamber rounds in your weapons. I should stress the "that I remember" part. I was a poor kid growing up, so I missed a lot of titles that likely featured these mechanics. Modern Warfare certainly didn't have this kind of attention to detail, which is more apt reason to bring it up. Although a pissing contest between Modern Warfare and Battlefield 3 is largely unfair, Modern Warfare had kicked off the beginning of the 7th console generation in 2007, whilst Battlefield 3 enjoyed the more established limitations of 2011.